Sound check. Julie, can you hear me okay? And are you seeing my slide deck? Advance your research data searching. Excellent. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. A lovely view of both libraries. Well, now my clock says that it's the top of the hour. I expect we'll get a few more people logging in at the last minute. So I will go ahead and make sure the recording is recording. It claims it is. And I'll give you the overview of what we're going to talk about today while people bop in for their last minute logins and hopefully eating their lunches. Good afternoon and welcome to this Advance Your Research webinar on data searching for secondary data analysis. We'll be talking about what data sets look like so that you can tell when you found a data set suitable for secondary analysis. And that's going to include how to think about what you need for your search strategy when you're working with data sets, some of the reasons why searching for data can be a challenge, and some sites and search tools that you can use to make it a little easier. This webinar is going to be mostly a lecture, not a demo of searching. And the reason for that is most of you know how to do general searching, but searching online for pizza, or even the ways that you search for journal articles, is very different from the way that you think about data searching. Computers are incredibly stupid, and data is extremely weird. And so we have to do a whole lot of thinking about our data research before we can really get into how to search for the data. So I'm going to give you some ideas for where to search and how, but most of this webinar is going to be the thinking that you do before putting anything into a search box. And you're probably wondering who I am and why I'm talking to you. I'm Nina Exner. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I'm the research data librarian here at VCU Libraries. I do data management consultations and training to help you handle your data. So if your department or class might need a special workshop, or you have a team of people who are sitting in the back going like, I never understand what this teacher is talking about with this data, you can contact me or ask your professor to contact me to set up a training session. Let me warn you though, I am not a statistician. I help people to find, describe, document, and clean their data for purposes of long-term use and analysis. But you don't want to talk to me about type 2 error in Bayesian modeling something, 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 because I'm not a statistician and I will not be the person that you want to talk to. Let's start with some terms. We always have to do this when we talk about data because anything can be data. Different researchers use all different kinds of things as data. In this webinar, we're focusing on quantitative data. That is to say that data that's mainly tables of numbers. But plenty of people use image sets or documents or web forum discussions or all kinds of other content as data. That's just too much to cover in a single webinar, so we're going to focus on the quantitative numbersy kind of data. Secondary analysis is when we analyze data that someone else has already collected for some different purpose. Not everyone calls that secondary analysis, so if you just came to find out what secondary analysis was, now you know. So for example, the census has a data set called PUMS, or the Public Use Microdata Sample. That PUMS data wasn't collected for you to analyze. It was collected as part of the census for voter redistricting and other census law stuff. But you might use it for a study on poverty and homelessness. We would call that secondary analysis because you're analyzing someone else's data and applying it to a new research question. I'll also be talking about data sets. In this case, a data set is a collection of data points. It might look like a spreadsheet, or it might look like a lot of plain text columns of numbers with tabs between them, or it might look like an SPSS or a Stata or SAS file. A data set is not, though, it is not a final statistic like a table that says Richmond is so many percent female and so many percent male or whatever. Statistics that are pre-calculated cannot be analyzed by you generally. And so that's not a data set for our purposes for this webinar. A data set has to have individual points that you can perform calculations on. And as Julie just mentioned, if you pre-registered for this webinar, the library is going to send out surveys with links to a couple of guides that can help you with this. Computer fail, sorry. So when we talk about a data set, it should have variables and it should have responses. A variable is something that represents some kind of a characteristic and has multiple values for different measurements of that characteristic. A response is a single collection event, such as a person answering a survey or a business reporting their income. So response level data is a data set that gives you each response in the data set. That may also be called microdata or item level data. Why do we care about that? Why do we care about variables and responses? Because that then leads to operationalization. Say that 10 times fast. Operationalization, operationalization. Which is the process of turning a concept that you want to measure for your research question into a specific way of representing that when we measure it in a given data point. So the construct of depression, for example, might be represented by a variable asking how sad someone feels. Or it might be represented in a variable asking how many days a person felt hopeless. Or it might be represented by combining those variables and maybe combining some others as well. So there are many different ways to turn a concept or a construct in technical terms into a specific variable. When you're searching for data for secondary analysis, it has to have that response level data. Otherwise, you can't reanalyze that. You're going to hear me say that a couple of times. Here's an example of what that response level data looks like. The left column here is an ID number for each person that was interviewed in this structured interview. And then for each person, we see things like how many people are in that household, whether they're married, what their gender is, and so on. If you wanted to test whether there's a significant difference in the size of that household based on the gender, or those households, I'm sorry, based on the genders of the heads of the households, you would need to have each individual response like this before you could do that kind of a statistical test. So just knowing what percentage were female versus male and what the distribution of the sizes of the households was in a summary wouldn't let you do the test that you want to do. So this microdata or response level data set is what you're searching for when we talk about finding data for secondary analysis. And that can be a challenge because when you just Google for something data, a lot of times you get the pre-processed, pre-analyzed kind of this many percentage of this and this many percentage of that statistics of the data. I saw a chat come up, and yes, slides will come up, will be sent out, and we'll be recording this and posting the recording as well. And thank you, Julie, for catching those. So within that data set, little mini data set that I just showed, a variable is one of the specific measures in the columns in that data set, representing a question in the structured interview, or maybe a response to a survey, or an observation during some kind of watching traffic or watching behaviors in a place, or some other specific thing that we're representing in the data. And you can see that in this variable's definition, that a variable in a data set will usually have a short name of some sort, in this case QN1B. That's a short representation for the label. In this case, the label is the question of what the interviewee's relationships to the head of household are. Then there are number values, like you've probably heard that a 1 might be a male and a 2 might be a female, or in this case, a 1 equals that the respondent is their own self. A 2 is the spouse was responding for the person. 3 is a non-spouse partner, and so on. We call these codes for the values of the variable. So sometimes you'll hear about coding and recoding data. These 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, those are the codes. And when you look at a data set, one of the things that you need to do to understand the data set is find a code book or a list of all these codes for the variables. And that'll show you things like what you see here of how many respondents were in each type, and what were the labels or the questions that were being asked. And you need that to understand whether the data is going to work for you or not. Here's another example of a variable from a codebook. And you can see the label and the name of the variable at the top, and then the codes and labels of the response values. And we use these kinds of codebooks to look through a data set to pick, does this have the responses that we want to consider to try to represent the constructs in our research question? So it's really important before you see the data to look at a codebook of these variables. An important issue is that if you want to run a statistical test for a correlation or a p-value, you need a data set where responses to all of the variables of interest are in each response. So you can only do a certain statistical test if a response has the answer to each variable that you care about. So like in my earlier example of the gender of the head of household and the size of the family, you could test that because each participant gave their gender and the size of their family. So you have to find all of your variables in the same data set, unless you want to do some really complicated statistical stuff. Typically, you have to find all of your variables in the same data set, and if some questions were only asked to part of the participant group, then you have to check that all the variables you care about were asked of all the same participants. So when you're searching, your goal is to find a data set that covers your topic, but also that data set covers each of your specific variables of interest within a single survey in that data set. So then, what happens if you don't find that? You may have to adjust your question to fit the data that exists. So one of the problems with secondary analysis is that the exact things that we want to know are not necessarily out there. So even if you had the perfect research question, if no one has collected and shared that data, then you can't answer your research question with secondary analysis. So earlier I mentioned in the definitions, I mentioned operationalization, that process of turning a concept we want to measure into a specific way of representing it when we measure it in a given data point. How you operationalize your constructs into specific variables might have to be adjusted based on the variables that you have access to. So that, in turn, might mean adjusting your question so that it matches the hypothesis that you can build based on the way that you can operationalize or define your constructs based on the variables that are available for you to work with. So it's kind of going to be a cycle of revising from your initial question based on the data and building a hypothesis and then tweaking your question. So let's try to give an example of that, because that's kind of abstract sounding. Let's imagine that our research question starts out as, how does depression relate to physical wellness? And then we look for data sets and we find a variable that measures how often a respondent was sad, so sad that nothing could cheer them up. And we decide that that will work for our operational definition of depression. I'm not necessarily saying that's the right variable for all situations, but let's assume that we decide that it works for us in this situation. Then we start exploring that same data set, and we find another variable where the respondent self-rates how good their overall health is. And we decide to operationalize health as physical health as how the participant rates their overall health. And you can see that that's maybe a little bit off of what we might have initially been thinking. Also, these are very simplistic operational definitions, but for this example, let's say we decide we can work with those operational definitions for our constructs. So now we have two variables, and they're in the same data set, and we have access to the response level data. Yay! That's what we need for secondary analysis, and we can build a hypothesis. In this case, we'll use a null hypothesis. If you don't know about null hypotheses, like I said, I'm not a statistician, so I'm going to ask you to talk about that to a statistics professor. That's outside of my expertise. But we build a null hypothesis that self-ratings of overall health will show no significant difference by how often the respondents feel that they have felt too sad, report that they have felt too sad to be able to cheer up. The alternative hypothesis that we're hoping for would presumably then be that there is a significant difference. So we've built our hypothesis, we've got our variables, we've built a hypothesis, and now we want to tweak our original research question to fit what we can really actually test. So then our final research question we'll be asking of this data is, are different levels of depression related to a difference in perceived overall health? And when we write up our methods section, we would have to discuss how we operationalized depression and health into these specific variables. So that's something that goes into your write-up of how you operationally defined, how you operationalized and went through the process of reaching an answer to your question. You're always going to need to put those operational definitions in your methods section really clearly. And even if your construct seems really simple, you should make it clear what your operational definitions were. For example, if you have state seems really clear and specific. I'm either in Virginia or I'm not, right? But when the respondents took the interview or the survey, was that the state that they live in, or the state that they work in, or the state that they're standing in when they're being interviewed? And even pretty common demographic questions of gender and race carry a lot of neocolonial, Eurocentric, heteronormative, patriarchal, et cetera, assumptions. And that may be honestly just fine if your research isn't concerned with colonialism and gender dynamics and power dynamics and so on. But if it is trying to dig into social forces and disparities and power dynamics, for example, then there may be some limitations in that operationalization that you want to think about. So every construct should have an operational definition in your methods write-up saying how you turned the idea into variables. Phew, okay. That was really technical, am I right? I know, I'm sorry. Let's take a deep breath. So we're really trying to talk about data set searching, right? Why am I getting into all of this deep, multi-syllable, operational, blah, blah, blah stuff? Well, honestly, you can all use a search box already. The trick with searching for data sets isn't in what keywords you put into the search box usually. It's really in making sure that you have all the structural pieces that I just mentioned, a single data set where the variables are close enough to your question for you to use. So the key to the whole issue, the big challenge with your data set searching, it's all in this issue of the variables and whether the variables will work for your constructs. So I mentioned the issue of changing your research question after you built a hypothesis from the variables, right? Secondary analysis, I already kind of said this, but I have to say it again. It usually requires some compromises. Your question and the available variables have to be balanced. You don't want to lose sight of your question of interest, but the variables usually won't be a perfect fit. So your theory or the definitions by which you're operationalizing your question, you have to use that to explain and maybe justify why a certain construct or idea in your question can be represented by the variables that you end up deciding to use. And if they don't fit right, you might have to change what your constructs are. Compromise and balance is very important. So back when I started talking about variables, I mentioned a codebook. And I showed you those slides where I had the variables and codes circled for the variable. Remember that? Good data sites will have a user's guide or a set of definitions or a code book or other list of all the variables, their values, and how those values are coded. A data set that doesn't have that stuff is useless. And pro tip for you as new or sometimes established researchers, if you ever collect your own data, don't forget to write up your own code book, or else your data will become useless too. Codebooks are critical information when working with data. And a lot of times you'll find secured data that you can't see the data because of privacy reasons without going through a whole process. But you can look for the codebook to decide, will this data work for me? So the first thing we'll get is a codebook. I think I've hit you with all these ideas that you need to explore a data set once you get the result and decide if it's useful for you. I think I've probably overhit you with these ideas. But really, when we're searching, it's all about the variables and the codebook, and getting to the data may be a separate step. We don't always get that immediately. And when we're deciding if it's useful to you, we really need to understand what it is that we're looking for. But I've re-emphasized that many times now. So let me finally get you to some actual search tools. I know that you're going to Google for it because we all Google. But let me suggest that instead of a basic Google, or in addition to a basic Google, you try Google's dataset search. Now this is still in beta, and every time I go into it, it has changed a bit. One of the reasons to use it, though, is there's a free button there. So you don't just end up going through dataset after dataset from commercial vendors, like you often do with searching plain Google. So use that free button before you get into looking at the search results. The thing with Google Dataset Search is that it only searches the names and summaries of datasets. So since it's new, it doesn't really dig into the variables yet very well. So you might be looking for how to relate teenagers' anxiety to their grades, but a dataset title might not talk about anxiety and grades. It might talk about mental health of adolescents, or even drug use and risky behaviors among adolescents. But they just happen to have collected grades or academic achievement as some kind of indicator of life success overall. So when you're searching Google Dataset Search, think of broad search terms that might cover your topic, and then check the data dictionaries or code books to see whether they have your exact variables. Let me also suggest data.gov, where you can look through a lot of US government data sites. It's kind of clunky, like a lot of government sites can be. And like a lot of data sites can be, honestly. But a lot of the best data comes from the government. It's a good place to get ideas at, too. So if you're just starting thinking about secondary analysis, and you're not sure what kinds of things data is tracked about, this is a good place to just kind of skim through and see, oh, I hadn't thought about ecosystems, or I hadn't thought about agriculture or the ocean. So it's a good place to see what kinds of things data is available for and just browse around. Another way to search for data sets is the library's subscription to ICPSR. And this is the one that I'm going to do a demo of. ICPSR has a lot of data, and unlike a lot of places you might search, it's optimized specifically for data searching. You can get into it through the library's homepages under all databases, and then ICPSR, or just search ICPSR on the library's page. If you think that you might want to access ICPSR data, go ahead when you are on campus and download something. It can just be a codebook instead of a whole data set, but the process of setting up an ICPSR account and using it to download something from an on-campus network, the VCU SafeNet Wireless, that will verify that you're a legitimate academic user. ICPSR takes their human subjects protections very seriously, so that verification of being a real academic user helps with their privacy security. In ICPSR, you can search either studies or variables. You tend to get a lot of results, but there are lots of buttons to narrow the data results down. And there's also ways to browse by themes. So again, if you're looking for ideas, that can help a lot if you're kind of flexible on your topic, but want to explore what the possibilities are. If you use the search, you'll end up with searches for studies and searches for variables. So when you're thinking about searching for variables, you want to be very, very specific in search terms. So remember when I was talking about depression a few minutes ago, and it could be sadness or it could be hopelessness? So think very narrowly about how you might operationalize your construct into a very specific measurable variable. Another option before I get to my demo, this isn't a search tool exactly, but a lot of times it's actually the best way to find a data set, is using the literature. As you're reading your articles on your research topic, keep an eye out for good articles that use a big data set. If you can find an article that's close enough to your topic, and if it used an existing data set, like it might say the US National Survey of something or other, you could then just search for that data set that they used. And even if it looks like the researcher collected their own data, but the analysis went in a slightly different direction than yours, but the data is similar, you could email that researcher and ask if you can get a copy of their data. That's not weird or anything. Researchers get those kinds of emails a lot. Mind you, because they get them a lot, they don't always answer those emails. So don't count on it for an assignment with a deadline. And don't take it personally if they ignore you. But if they have data, maybe they'd be willing to collaborate with you. All right, so let me show you ICPSR because I think it's useful and because it takes a lot of getting used to. So I'm hitting the library and I'm heading to ICPSR. Oh, happy Love Data Week. Now I'm going to, oh, I'm off the board a little bit here. I'm going to come up to this. Okay, I'm not going to go to the search box because there's a search box up at the very, very top, but I'm getting it blocked off by my Chrome bar, which it wasn't when I practiced, but I think it's having a little bit of issues with Zoom. So I'm going to search for ice cream. We all love ice cream, right? This could be interesting because you're looking into consumer behaviors or into the engineering of food or obesity management or eating habits and mental health. There's lots of great topics around food choices and food behavior. You'll see that there's 300 studies. So we've got lots of stuff here on ice cream. But as you look at them, they're covering all different kinds of time periods. We've got stuff from the 30s here, stuff from the 1800s even. So there's old stuff, there's new stuff, there's lots of different things coming up. They cover a lot of time periods. And you also see that there's some of these that are international from India and Brazil. So you can use these things on the side here on the left to narrow down. The first thing I'm going to do is restriction type public use. If you're doing a dissertation or something, you may have the time frame, or if you're working towards a journal article, you might have the time frame to use restricted use. But if you're doing like a senior project or even a master's thesis, you may not want those restricted use ones. So I'm going to go for public use. And then I'm also going to narrow the time period to since 2000. I know some of you might have been born around 2000, but I have to warn you, since recent data is really hard to get. You never get data from the current year because it's still being collected. And even 2019 may still be being collected since we're so early in 2020. And 2018 is a lot of times still in processing. It takes a lot of statisticians and data scientists and all kinds of people to process data for accuracy and privacy and codebook checking and stuff. So you're usually expecting something 5 to 10 years old minimum for data outside of the really fast-moving and expensive consumer monitoring data. But that commercial consumer monitoring data is quite pricey. So those things where they've got big teams to move data fast, those are not going to be free. So we want to stick with what's easier to get, what's free, and we'll see what we can do with the last 20 years. So you'll see there's a lot of different studies, from TV polls to government and state surveys. Some of these are focused just on youth. Others don't seem to be specific. I didn't narrow, it's hard to narrow to just US, so you have to think about, is it okay to look at just New York or Baltimore, just one city? Or do you need it to be a sort of national scope of survey? So I'm going to go with this National Health Interview Survey, this number 16 here. Once I've gone into a specific study here, I want to look first at the project description to see what kinds of things are included in it. If the description looks good, looks like it's going to have relevant concepts, then I'm going to go over here to the variables, and I'm going to see, where is my ice cream represented? Come on, variables. So why ice cream? Why did you come up? So is this a useful variable on ice cream? I get how many times did you eat ice cream in the last month? Yeah, last month. If I decide that that is useful, if I'm looking for ice cream flavors and what flavors did they like the best, I'm going to need to look further. But if I just want to know how much ice cream do they eat, then I can click on the variable, and it will give me an idea about that variable. So what we've got is the number of units of ice cream that they got, from 0 or 1. I never ate any ice cream last month, all the way up to 90, which I'm a little skeptical about. And it looks like most people are in the couple of times last month. I can also scroll through nearby variables that they were giving at the same time that they gave this interview. So I've got other foods like popcorn and cookies and even meat and vegetables and brown rice, all kinds of stuff. If I decide that this is looking pretty interesting, so my frequency of eating ice cream, if that's one of the variables that I want, then what I'm going to need to do is access the documentation or codebook. It's probably time to look through the whole survey. So I'm going to back up one. And I'm going to click on survey because I made my backup one button disappear. And I've got a preview of the data and the data documentation and a sense of all the different pieces that this interview had. And I can download just the documentation, or I can, because I hit the public button, so it's got to be things that I can it's only going to show me results where I can go ahead and download the data. I can go ahead and do that. But really, before I get into trying to understand the numbers in the data, the 1s and 2s and 30s, I really want to look at the documentation to see if it's got variables I want. And then it's going to ask me, am I going to respect the privacy of the users? Do I accept their terms of use? Am I going to behave in an ethical manner? I'm going to agree with that. And that's going to let me download the documentation. The reason I mentioned earlier, though, the reason that you need to download something while you're on the VCU SafeNet Wireless is so that they can identify you as being a bona fide, real academic. That's what I was talking about when I said you could just download anything. It could just be the codebook. I can, let's see, okay, I'm sorry. If I just want to look at a preview, and the one, the ice cream I wanted was, I think, in this DS7. This is what that code book is going to look like, and these books are pretty long. I can see what are all the different things that they've asked, and it's going to go through, like that preview that I showed, where I had the little screenshots of what the codes are. It'll show you, here are all the race codings that they used. And it's going to go through all the different things that they asked in that questionnaire. This is where you would need to check to see if all the variables that you're thinking of operationalizing for your research question are in there. So say, for example, if I needed to look at race and ethnicity, if the races that I'm interested in aren't represented, they may not have had any respondents from other groups. So then I have to think about, do the racial dynamics I'm looking at in my research question, do those fit? Okay, so you can see this is a long code book. It would be a lot of reading to go through it, but you would then have the chance to kind of think about what you might want to do. But let me get back to my, oh, I hit it. Give me a second. It's behaving differently with Zoom than, oh, I know what the problem is. It's being different with Zoom on than it was when I was testing this. I apologize. I want to escape full screen. So there we go. I apologize for that delay. Total technology idiot there. So that was my demo. And let me just give you one more pointer here about a library subscription database called Sage Research Methods. If you're trying to remember your stats class, or if you're like most of us and your stats class and your research methods class don't quite line up perfectly, it can be really hard to decide what you want to do statistically once you have your data set. And even if you remember, oh, a t-test, I think I remember I want to do something like a t-test. You might want to look up information on how do you do a t-test? How do you write up a t-test? Are there any limitations and issues of error and validity in a t-test? So this Sage Research Methods from the library's all databases list is a great database to visit, both for a great section called Which Stats Test, but also for reading up on specific statistical tests. So it will have journal articles, book chapters, all kinds of discussions about how to do statistics, what are your limitations. It's very useful for finding literature to support your methods section. Okay, I threw a whole lot at you. So thank you very much for listening. And I left time for some questions here because I knew this was going to be so much to kind of deal with. And I'm also going to stay on further. So give me your questions. And I see one on, will having the VPN on, would accessing through the VPN be okay for downloading the file when you're not on campus? Yes. If you are accessing and you go through the VCU VPN to authenticate that you are VPNing in as if you were on campus, and then hit the library website and go to ICPSR, it should download the file as if you were physically on campus, because once you VPN in, that will be exactly the same as being on campus. So that should be fingers crossed there. If you try it and it doesn't work, give me a Zoom call and I'll be happy to work with you. What other questions do you have? Do you have to be on campus every time you use ICPSR? No, just the first time that you download. So it sets something, when you use ICPSR, it's going to ask you to either create a My ICPSR account or use your Google login to log in to ICPSR, your mymail.vcu.edu or your vcu.edu email Google account to log in. And the first time after you've created that account, you want to hit a download so that it pulls up that pop-up that came up for me that you saw. That asked me to agree to the ethics guidelines and terms of use. Once I've done that, I agree once, it will set that my account has been used from a real VCU location, and so that gives it an extra proof that I'm a real person. Can alumni access ICPSR? You would probably have to come to campus to do that. I don't think you would be able to access ICPSR from home as an alumnus, but there is a section of ICPSR called Open ICPSR that has typically small data sets, not the big data national surveys that have thousands of people talking about their ice cream eating habits. Typically, you would have access only to those medium and small data sets that are in Open ICPSR, but there are a few of the large surveys that are also available through Open ICPSR, and that's available to everyone. If you're still in the Richmond area, you could come to campus to access ICPSR too, and once you've downloaded the data set, you see I've got a little zip file here at the bottom of my screen. That means I've downloaded the data set and I can unzip it in order to get all the stuff that I downloaded out of it. If you're a student and do the setup thing while you're on campus, but then you graduate, could you continue using it as an alumni? I think you could for a year, but I would have to look into the ICPSR guidance. I think that setting that says that you have accessed expires once a year. Says that you have accessed on campus. What they're really trying to do is prevent people from claiming that they're a VCU person, but they've moved on to industry and they're actually going to be downloading this data in order to give it to a company to use in ways that are not actually in accordance with the usage terms and privacy terms. So that's what they're trying to prevent from happening. So I think you would be able to continue to use it as an alumnus for a while, but that will expire sooner or later. Any other questions? Those are good questions all. The access to ICPSR from off campus is a little bit wacky. Is there a way a nonprofit could join ICPSR? Is it supposed to be strictly academic use? Nonprofits with clear research-oriented purposes and with an ethics oversight arrangement of some sort. So some sort of IRB arrangement, whether it's within that nonprofit or whether they use contract-based IRB oversight for ethics oversight of research, should be able to join ICPSR. They're really the big thing that they're trying to control is that human subjects, that there's someone keeping an eye on the usage. So yes, I think a nonprofit organization could join ICPSR, but they have to verify that they have a research use. A lot of ICPSR questions, and that's totally understandable. I did try to, hopefully, some of the other questions the other resources that you saw, like data.gov, a lot of the stuff where you want like a genuinely generalizable systematic random sample or simple random sample that represents the whole nation and all the states within the nation. A lot of times those stratified and simple random samples that are really large scale, those tend to be run through the government because it's super hard if someone here at VCU wants to sample the entire state. It's actually really hard to get a true random sample of everyone if you're not the government. So a lot of times those are going to be government-based surveys or government-based interviews, and those tend to be available through the government agencies one way or the other. So data.gov may actually get you what you need. But ICPSR a lot of times has the kind of nichier things, and then the ones that are done through like CBS and a lot of the polling services about kind of public opinion polls. Those may be in ICPSR more. And also, I'm happy to do ICPSR training if anyone wants to set up a session like that for a class, or you've got a group of people working on a project, or I guess a nonprofit organization that's working would also be something I'd be happy to engage with. Another question, do those government agencies also have IRB type structures in place to also have human research subject protection? How does confidentiality work with government data sets? Oh my goodness. That's the simple answer is yes. They do have extensive IRB type structures in place. There is, I could talk for hours on confidentiality and government data sets. So the census, it's the decennial census year. 2020 census will be coming out in a couple of months. Please take your census. Things like the census have very, very tight restrictions on how you can retrieve the data and what you can retrieve. So, for example, you can't, without going through a very, very rigorous authentication process, you can't get a report from the census website that says how many Native American people of the Mormon faith with they wouldn't have HIV, but with 3 children, and I'm trying to think of what else other questions might be in the census, and are currently living in group housing or in semi-homeless conditions, or are living under the poverty level. You wouldn't be able to find that for Richmond because the risk of identifying the one, what did I say, Mormon Native American with 3 children in Richmond, would be very high. And so accidentally finding out that one Native American Mormon with 3 children, if that's what I said, that person is living below the poverty level, that would be really risky, that someone might accidentally identify someone. So there's a lot of, the reason the census takes years before we can actually access the data is because they go through a very complicated human subject protection and privacy protection process to make sure that people don't accidentally find out who is homeless or who is living at the poverty level or who is incredibly rich. And we don't want people necessarily to find out that we have a whole bunch of money either. So they're very particular about how data can be accessed. If you want to get to that person-by-person level data for the census, you actually have to verify who you are and why you're doing it, and then go to a census center. And you can't take the data with you. You have to do all of the analysis there, and they check your files to make sure that you don't take anything that might accidentally disclose who those people are. And they're always very strict on that, but they're being very conscientious about the risk of immigrants being identified this year, because that's such a hot button topic. They're always very strict about how to protect that privacy. So they would be very cautious about whether there's any way that people might kind of finagle the data to identify the possible presence of immigrants in an area, of disclosing that someone is poor or rich or homeless or anything like that. They're very cautious about that, and they go through, every time they do one of these big things, they have oversight through an ethics board and a lot of governance. And then they also, after the data is collected, have a lot of statisticians kind of try to stress test it, and a lot of data scientists go through and see, can we data mine the data to try to find things out. So the government surveys probably have more human subjects protection than you can reasonably expect from, say, your cell phone company or from Google or Facebook. Confidentiality is really picky with data sets, and they also, there are certain things that they won't collect, and then certain things that even if they do collect, they won't give any access to. And then those are things like sexual behaviors, illegal drug use, things that might be used against someone legally. And then there are things that are kind of sensitive, like you're having cancer or something that people might be worried about getting fired over. Those kinds of things, you have to verify that you're a bona fide researcher and not just some random schmo trying to mine through data to try to look for sensitive issues. So and that's the short version of it. Confidentiality for government data sets is super complicated. And thank you for that question. And I could talk for that about that for ages and ages and ages. And the stuff that you can find in the open government data sets and in ICPSR is typically going to be things that would be very hard to mine for privacy violating things. Then and even so, you still have to sign that agreement that you're not going to try to mine it to violate anyone's privacy. But then there are restricted use data sets in ICPSR and also, for that matter, through a lot of the government agencies, like the Department of Education, that to access those restricted use data sets, you have to file a security plan and an analysis plan and a whole lot of steps to show how you're going to protect those subjects and verify that what you're doing is a real research plan. So there are these restricted data sets that you can access, but even those require a lot of hoops to get through, and they still aren't going to have people's personal information like their name, and a lot of times they won't have zip code or the HIPAA health identifiers. Those a lot of times will be not in there. Anything having to do with youth, people under 18, are particularly likely to have more restrictions on it, particularly because teenagers, we always want to protect teenagers and children because there are risks to asking them research questions because they may not understand consent. Although, you know, in the information age, everyone has already given away so much of their data that people's perceptions of data privacy are changing. But the government is still doesn't want to be the people who violate your privacy, at least not in that way. That was a long answer to your question. I apologize. Do we have any other questions? Then I'm going to stop the recording. If you want to